She was called into homes at midnight, when screams rose louder than prayers. For centuries, the midwife was both savior and suspect, delivering life and accused of birthing monsters. Tonight you will learn the horrifying price she paid, not only in blood, but in her very humanity. Childbirth in the ancient and medieval world was not the celebrated miracle modern imagination often paints it to be. It was a battlefield without drums, a place where survival was tenuous and death was common. The screams of women in labor accompanied every village and city across Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Mortality rates were staggering. Estimates drawn from burial records suggest that perhaps as many as 1 in 3 women died as a direct result of pregnancy or childbirth complications. In some regions during the Middle Ages, for the surviving mother, health was rarely restored. Infection, tearing, and bleeding often ensured a shortened life even if the delivery went well. For the child, survival was scarcely better. In the early medieval period, estimates in some places suggest nearly half of infants never reached their first birthday. At the center of this fragile struggle stood the midwife. She was indispensable, one of the few figures in society equipped with specialized knowledge about childbirth. Yet her knowledge was not medical in today's sense. It was inherited, oral, carried in the memory of women who had seen countless births and deaths. They brought herbs, cloths, wooden tools, hips covered in ashes to mitigate bleeding, and whispered prayers. The midwife's work balanced between miracle and futility. Every birth tested her, every death condemned her. Unlike physicians trained in monasteries and universities, men who often had no direct experience with childbirth itself, the midwife was present in the stifling, blood-choked rooms where birth unfolded. And because she was there, she often bore the blame. When the child was malformed, neighbors whispered of curses. When the mother died, families whispered of poison. When the child died unbaptized, the midwife was accused of negligence or demonic complicity. The systemic cruelty of this suspicion was common across societies. In ancient Greece, Aristotle himself wrote that monstrous births were the result of nature and error or corruption, embedding a cultural precedent that children born with disabilities were not only unwanted but conceptually threatening. These ideas seeped into Roman law, which permitted exposure of malformed infants. The midwife who oversaw such births was forever tainted by association. She did not simply deliver children. She delivered evidence of sin, corruption, or divine judgment. By the medieval period, these interpretations hardened into weaponized fear. In Catholic Europe, the theological weight of baptism made the moment of childbirth even more perilous. An infant who died unbaptized was considered lost to eternal limbo, denied the kingdom of heaven. The responsibility for this fate fell on the midwife's shoulders. She was often urged, even forced, to baptize the child herself if she feared it might not survive. But if she did so incorrectly, she was accused of spiritual malpractice. It was a no-win trap, constructed by theology and enforced by fear. Most horrifying of all was how these suspicions bled into legal condemnation. From the 13th century onward, numerous documented cases show midwives being accused of witchcraft. Any woman who spent her life near blood, dying women, and malformed infants was an easy target for inquisitors. Manuals such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum explicitly described midwives as dangerous, accusing them of killing infants, secretly desecrating baptisms, or even dedicating newborns to demonic powers. What was in reality the unavoidable tragedy of high mortality became stylized in the language of crime. The midwife was less a professional than a scapegoat waiting for her turn at the stake. The horror was doubled by the silence of the victims. Mothers who died had no say. Children lost left no testimony. Only neighbors, church officials, and magistrates wrote records, and in every inked line, blame was disproportionately forced on the midwife. Even in the archives, her voice was muted or absent, surviving only in accusations, confessions signed under torture, and execution records. One must understand that in this context, the very act of being born was accompanied not only by a risk of death, but by the political risk of accusation. The midwife lived in the shadow of her profession. To help was to risk suspicion, to fail was to face death. She comforted screaming mothers, yet she herself lived beneath a sword. This is the blood price of birth in human history, a price levied not just on ordinary women dying in childbirth, but on those who tried to help them. The midwives became mothers of shadows, marked by suspicion, often condemned for what was beyond human control. Childbirth was not just peril, it was a crucible where life itself was cast into judgment, and where women bore horrors beyond the comprehension of those who ruled their fates. In nearly every agrarian and urban community of the ancient and medieval world, midwives stood at the fragile frontier between life and death. Their role was indispensable, yet their presence was accompanied by a permanent suspicion. The paradox was cruel. They were simultaneously revered as guardians of new life and damned as suspected agents of death. Religious authorities, political leaders, and common families placed enormous trust in them, but that trust existed inside a framework of fear. To deliver an infant was an act of salvation, but when birth ended in death, suspicion fell on the very woman who had risked her own safety to intervene. Across medieval Europe, midwives were registered as both servants of God and potential enemies of the faith. Early Christian writings reveal this duality. Church fathers emphasized the sanctity of baptism, and records show that women acting as midwives were often granted extraordinary powers, including the authority to baptize an infant at the moment of birth if the child seemed likely to die. This consecrated role suggests honor and recognition. Yet it also amplified the danger to the women themselves. If a midwife failed to utter the correct words, or if a child expired before water touched its head, responsibility was laid upon her soul. In regions such as France and the German states, theologians began to link midwives to heresy and sin by the 13th century. The very intimacy of their work, blood-stained hands, knowledge of women's anatomy, familiarity with herbs and remedies, marked them as outsiders to the male-dominated structures of knowledge and power. Unlike licensed male physicians, whose authority derived from written texts and university training, midwives embodied oral wisdom and communal memory. Their competence made them valuable, yet their independence made them dangerous. Suspicion crossed cultural boundaries. In the Islamic world of the medieval Middle East, midwives were legally recognized and sometimes employed by elite households, yet even here they occupied a liminal space. Some were celebrated, but others became expendable scapegoats when childbirth produced tragedy. In the records of Ottoman courts, cases appear where women acting as midwives were accused of negligence or sorcery and punished accordingly, showing that an atmosphere of anxiety encircled them regardless of creed. The tension was steepest in Europe, where political and theological upheavals fueled paranoia. By the 15th century, witchcraft accusations increasingly mentioned midwives. Manuals such as the Malleus Maleficarum did not simply accuse them of spiritual corruption, but claimed that midwives actively colluded with demonic forces. The text alleged that they killed infants before baptisms, offered their bodies to devils, or dedicated newborns to heresy. What was once a fearful whisper about failed birth became institutional doctrine about midwives' guilt. Yet these same communities depended on them. Despite their reputation, midwives were always summoned. Rural villages had no access to professional physicians. Noble households required women for intimate tasks of delivery. Even the clergy who denounced midwives readily employed them. The duality deepened, despised in theory, indispensable in practice. Women who carried out this labor were trapped in a cycle of contradiction. Gratitude from families was fleeting, erased the moment tragedy struck. Praise in one season could collapse into torture the next. To be trusted only to be condemned was their daily reality. a paradox that left them perpetually walking on the edge of accusation. The symbolic weight placed upon their shoulders grew unbearably heavy. In childbirth, midwives were associated with life. In theological scrutiny, they were linked to death. The spectrum between sacred and damned was not two opposite extremes, but one continuous burden. Moving even slightly in one direction could destroy them. This fundamental contradiction defined their existence. As guardians of childbirth, they embodied the most necessary of human labors, but as potential witches, they became the focus of some of history's darkest trials. Suspicion was not a rare occurrence, it was their permanent condition. In the ancient world, childbirth existed not only as a private ordeal, but as a public statement. Every infant born was a new subject, a new laborer, an heir, or a vessel of inheritance. Birth was rarely regarded as neutral. From village huts to royal courts, the act of delivering a child was intertwined with power, symbolism, and control. Midwives operated inside this charged environment, where ritual often outweighed science and survival hinged on tradition. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded charms and prayers spoken over women in labor. In Greece and Rome, protective amulets were tied to the body of the mother, warding off spirits believed to prey on both mother and infant. These rituals, intended to comfort, also served a darker purpose. They created a framework of blame. When birth ended in tragedy, failure was never left to chance. Someone had to be responsible, and the midwife, often handling both herbs and sacred incantations, was positioned at the center of judgment. By the medieval period, the fusion of religion and childbirth reached suffocating intensity. The Church regarded childbirth as both necessary for human survival and permanently marked by sin, a consequence of Eve's transgression. The agony of labor was interpreted as divine punishment, and every failed birth became further proof. Midwives, present at every birth, became participants not just in survival, but in theology. Their very presence symbolized the boundary between divine will and human intervention. Communities developed rituals that reflected this tension. In some regions of medieval Europe, priests blessed birthing chambers, sprinkling holy water on the bed where a woman writhed in pain. In others, sanctified candles were burned to ward off demons believed to lurk where women gave birth. Families often insisted upon whispered prayers, charms tied around ankles, or pieces of sacred text placed underneath mattresses. These practices, however, easily turned into accusations. If prayers were said yet the mother bled to death, suspicion fell upon the one overseeing the process. Was the midwife careless? Did she utter the wrong words? And if she used herbs to ease labor pains, were those herbs sacred cures or the tools of sorcery? This policing of childbirth was not only spiritual, it was political. Inheritance and lineage were central to power. Noble lineages desperately required heirs. Queens and noblewomen were pressed by entire dynasties, their bodies reduced to vessels of reproduction. Failure to produce a healthy male heir at the right time invited whispers of failure and betrayal. Midwives were entangled in these struggles. If a stillbirth occurred in a royal chamber, it was not simply personal tragedy, it was a crisis of dynastic legitimacy. The midwife, an outsider to court politics, shouldered the unbearable weight of responsibility for circumstances no human could control. The contradictions multiplied in common households. Peasant families depended upon multiple sons and daughters for labor and survival. Each lost child weakened entire lineages, destabilizing farms, marriages, and communities. Here again, the midwife bore the risk. If her remedies failed, or if her presence coincided with death, neighbors interpreted it not as bad fortune, but as malevolent action. Ritual fed suspicion, and suspicion fed punishment. Women themselves were subjected to horrifying cultural customs. In parts of medieval Europe, women were forced to give birth within strict religious rituals. sometimes tethered by superstition that demanded their suffering remain unaided. Painkillers were often forbidden, intentionally withheld because labor pain was seen as punishment for humanity's fall. To offer too much relief was to defy divine will. Thus, midwives walked an impossible line: help enough to prevent death, but not so much that it could be construed as subversion of God's punishment. Their role was wrapped in contradiction, and in that contradiction lay the seed of accusation. Even more chilling was the role of forced rituals around baptism. If a newborn emerged sickly, the midwife was expected to race against time to baptize the child before death stole it away. Some traditions demanded the midwife carry water herself, murmur the baptismal formula, and pronounce salvation. Yet if the child still died, blame was instant. Whole families accused midwives of negligence, false sacrament, or demonic error. Manuals circulated among clergy, warning of the so-called demonic midwife, who purposely withheld or corrupted baptism. This blended faith with cruelty. In a moment when a woman had already fought through mortal pain only to lose a child, grief demanded a culprit, and midwives served that function. Rituals of control, meant to sanctify childbirth, became instruments of suspicion and fear. They reinforced the woman as vessel, the child as inheritance, and the midwife as scapegoat. The process transformed a biological act into a theater of loyalty, piety, and hierarchy. A successful birth brought gratitude, fleeting in its warmth. But a failed birth invited whispers of conspiracy, accusations of heresy, and sometimes death sentences for those who had dared to assist. The very rituals meant to ensure safety, sanctity, and order only deepened human cruelty. They imposed suffering, enhanced blame, and increased suspicion. They transformed midwives from guardians into suspects, and births from moments of renewal into crucibles of judgment. In historical records, archives, and chronicles from antiquity through the medieval period, one theme recurs with chilling regularity. Infants who did not match social or religious expectations were marked as cursed, monstrous, or even demonic. These newborns were not merely vulnerable lives. They were shadows, omens of divine anger, warnings of corruption, or proof of heresy. The superstition began early. In Greek and Roman thought, malformed children were rarely seen as natural accidents. Aristotle described such births as failures of nature, deviations that proved disorder in the world. The Roman philosopher Seneca coldly noted that we drowned children who at birth are weakly and abnormal, treating the destruction of deformed children as a civic duty. Such pronouncements hardened cultural attitudes. From the perspective of those eras, the appearance of a disabled child or one showing physical difference was never neutral. It was a statement of fate. Someone was to blame. By the medieval centuries, these attitudes deepened under theological frameworks. The Church emphasized the miracle of creation, but viewed deviations from the normal body as indictments of sin or judgment from God. Children born with deformities, stillbirths, or multiple births like twins carried heavy spiritual meaning. Communities interpreted them as punishments for hidden sin, curses from demons, or evidence of deals with the devil. The midwife was trapped at the center of these births. She was the one who held the malformed child, who lifted it from the blood of its mother, who pronounced whether it lived, and who decided whether baptism could even occur. In the private homes of peasants, shocked neighbors assembled. In noble halls, priests and officials demanded immediate answers. Who has brought this monster forth? Who bears the mark of guilt? For mothers, the grief was double-edged. They lost the joy of a healthy child, but faced accusations that they had sinned in secret, conceived through adulterous or illicit means, or committed sacrilege. For midwives, the danger was mortal. Delivering these children of shadows could taint an entire reputation. A lifetime of service to communities could be undone in a single night of tragedy. Records from city chronicles in the Holy Roman Empire describe midwives dragged before magistrates after the birth of infants with malformed heads, extra limbs, or perceived animal-like features. Their knowledge of herbs and remedies, once praised, was twisted into accusations that they had caused the deformity. This terror extended to twins and multiple births. In communities across Europe, twins were viewed with superstitious suspicion. Reports from the 5th–10th century note that some accused midwives of creating double births through witchcraft, conjuring two lives where only one was meant to exist. Such charges often carried the consequence of execution. Even when twins were spared, mothers and midwives alike were whispered about for years, their reputations permanently scarred. Infanticide accusations linked directly to these beliefs. If a child was stillborn or deformed, midwives could be accused of killing it to conceal its supposed monstrous form. When tiny graves were uncovered near villages, blame fell not on fathers desperate to silence scandal, but on the women who assisted in birth. Torture produced confessions. Midwives confessed not only to murdering infants, but to feeding them to animals, to demons, or to supposed covens. These confessions, meaningless under the agony of pain, were entered into legal record as proof of guilt. History still preserves them in chilling detail. The survival of historical phrases demonstrates the cruelty vividly. Infants called monstrum in Latin texts, monsters rather than children. English chronicles recorded changelings, infants thought to be swapped by fairies or demons. In many cases, the midwife was tragically accused of being the one who enabled this switch, the silent partner of infernal powers. Behind these accusations lay a brutal social logic, anxiety about the survival of communities. Every child mattered, economically and spiritually. A child unable to work, a child perceived as unworthy, became a threat to fragile survival systems held together by agriculture, inheritance, and faith. Instead of seeing a child as a being with potential dignity, communities buried their fear in accusations. The midwife, standing between grief and survival, bore the punishment. The horrifying truth is that countless midwives were executed, tortured, or exiled, not because they harmed children, but because the children they delivered did not conform to community expectations. In their arms lay infants who carried no guilt, only deformity, frailty, or tragedy. Yet society transformed these children into shadows and branded the women who carried them into the world as accomplices of evil. In these stories, one meets the full cruelty of human history. Mothers grieving, infants discarded, fathers complicitly silent, and midwives condemned to the pyre. Children of Shadows is not only a metaphor, it is a record of how fear turned innocent lives into symbols of curse, and how women who sought to help were forced to pay the price of demons others imagined. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, terror against midwives reached its most systematic and horrifying form. What had existed for centuries as whispers and suspicions hardened into organized trials, codified accusations, and mass executions. Midwives whose hands were stained not with guilt, but with the unavoidable blood of birth, became prime targets in the era of witch hunts. The emergence of inquisitorial manuals sealed their fate. The most infamous, Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, singled out midwives with chilling precision. It accused them of offering infants to demons, preventing births, or destroying fertility itself. Unlike vague folklore, such texts gave legal and religious authorities a framework. They transformed rumor into doctrine. Wherever a child died or a woman failed to conceive, the midwife could be blamed. Trial records from German principalities and French dioceses recount consistent patterns. A midwife was often denounced after a birth that ended in death. Summoned by magistrates, she was interrogated until exhaustion stripped her defenses. "Why did you fail to save the infant?" became, "Did you give the child to the devil?" The logic was cruelly circular. To deny was to defy authority. To confess was to seal death. Under torture, Countless women admitted to crimes impossible outside imagination. Some confessed to flying at night to attend demonic gatherings, others to smearing infants in oil. It was not truth that interested inquisitors, but submission. Methods of interrogation magnified the horror. Binding, stretching, burning, and crushing were applied with clinical repetition until a woman's words bent to expectation. Historian Lyndall Roper records that torture chambers in Augsburg and Würzburg frequently heard women midwives describe spectral sabbaths, demon pacts, and infanticide, confessions produced not by evidence but by agony. Once written into court records, these words became proof, justifying yet more executions. Execution itself carried ritual symbolism. Midwives accused of witchcraft were often burned at the stake, their destruction staged as public warning. Chroniclers tell of entire towns gathering to watch. Flames transformed skilled caregivers into lessons of fear. In communities lacking proper gallows or executioners, neighbors sometimes stoned or drowned women themselves. Few resisted. Fear silenced those who might have defended the innocent. The psychological violence extended into collective memory. Midwives were no longer seen as individuals with names and histories, but as caricatures of evil. Their presence in birth chambers, once vital, became tinged with dread. Communities began to record fewer midwifery traditions, erasing women's knowledge that had sustained generations. What survived was preserved by men in universities, gradually stripping midwives of authority. Witch hunts thus accomplished two goals. They destroyed women's lives, and they transferred knowledge to male-dominated institutions of medicine. Nor was persecution random. Demographics made midwives easy scapegoats. They were older, poorer, and widowed, all categories vulnerable to accusation. Their daily work exposed them to blood, deformity, and death, placing them in proximity to what communities most feared. Some estimates suggest that in German-speaking lands alone, thousands of women acting as midwives faced charges over 2 centuries. Not all were executed, but many bore permanent stigma after torture or imprisonment. The tragedy is heightened by remembering what they endured in silence. They had cradled dying infants, consoled grieving mothers, and faced rooms filled with anguished cries. In return, they were chained, humiliated, tortured, and burned. What they symbolized, both life and death, fertility and loss, made them irresistible scapegoats in an age that could not accept misfortune without blame. The witch hunts reveal not a war on superstition, but a war on women who embodied knowledge outside sanctioned control. By criminalizing midwives, authorities weaponized fear to attack independence, wisdom, and resilience. Every pyre lit with straw carried more than a woman's body. It carried centuries of tradition passing into smoke and silence. Childbirth in the medieval and early modern period was not only haunted by superstition and accusation, it was also scarred by the physical instruments that accompanied it. The entry of tools into birthing chambers promised aid, but frequently delivered agony. In an age before antisepsis, anesthesia, or scientific obstetrics, surgical interventions more often mutilated than healed. The objects of survival became instruments of suffering. The simplest tools were also the most dangerous. Crude knives, hooks, and forceps were developed to extract infants when mothers could no longer push. The so-called crochet, a sharp metal hook, was used to dismember a fetus inside the womb if it was lodged or obstructing the canal. The procedure, recorded in medical texts of the 14th and 15th centuries, aimed to save the mother's life at the expense of the child. Rarely did either survive. The act itself left scars so severe that subsequent pregnancies often became impossible, sealing women's fate. Medieval cesarean sections carry horrors of their own. Performed almost exclusively when the mother was already dying or dead, early caesareans were acts less of hope than of desperation. Midwives sometimes cut open corpses of women in frantic attempts to save infants for baptism, ensuring the child's soul did not vanish unblessed. Surviving medical record books describe those operations with heavy matter-of-factness, noting how knives sliced open abdomens on kitchen tables or church floors. The mothers had no voice. Their bodies became vessels of ritual extraction. Another tool, the speculum, re-emerged during the medieval period in crude bronze or iron versions. Far from instruments of gentle examination, their widening mechanisms often tore fragile tissues, leaving women scarred or septic. The suffering of women was accepted as necessary for knowledge. Anatomical manuals from universities, written and copied by men, describe procedure without acknowledging agony. Pain was simply dismissed as expected punishment in childbirth, an echo of theology. Beyond surgical tools, even everyday birthing implements carried torment. Binding straps were used not only to secure women during convulsions, but to restrain them from moving freely, amplifying pain. Herbal concoctions intended to soothe often were toxic in high doses. Ergot, pennyroyal, and heavily brewed wines became sources of poisoning. Still, midwives were forced to administer them, torn between desperate hope and the knowledge that remedies killed as often as they cured. These instruments of suffering deepened the atmosphere of blame around midwives. When survival failed, sharp metal edges or unknown herbs became evidence of sorcery. A hook found within a basket could be recast in trial testimony as the devil's claw. A jar of dried plants could be written into parchment as witch's poison. Thus, the very attempt to relieve agony became grounds for condemnation. Modern medicine sometimes traces its lineage back to these tools, but their true legacy lies in the lives they destroyed. Women bled to death as knives sliced too deep. Infants were torn apart piece by piece inside the birth canal. Midwives stood in rooms suffused with screams, knowing that surviving families and clerics outside the chamber would judge them guilty regardless of outcome. The cold truth is that obstetric knowledge advanced by sacrificing countless women, using pain itself as the textbook. The price of progress, if progress it can be called, was inscribed in flesh and bone. And always, the midwife bore the visible stain of the blade, the weight of the corpse, the smell of the herbs. Proof, in the eyes of society, not of service, but of unspeakable crime. The archive of history is full of voices, rulers inscribing decrees, priests dictating sermons, magistrates recording judgments. Yet when one turns to the lives of midwives, mothers, and infants, a profound absence emerges. Their voices are nearly erased. What survives are accusations, denunciations, and confessions forced under torture. The silence of the very women who carried the burden of childbirth is one of history's most haunting voids. Records of midwives rarely appear in their own hand. Literacy was uncommon for women outside convents, and even when letters existed, few were preserved. Instead, their identities survive in fragments within court registries, a name followed by the word witch, or an account of execution. What knowledge they possessed, herbal remedies, birthing positions, prayers passed through generations, vanished with them. Their traditions were oral, fragile, never considered worthy of parchment unless distorted into hostile testimony. The archives of witch trials demonstrate this erasure with relentless repetition. Hundreds of pages exist describing torture chambers, interrogations, and gruesome punishments. Priests and judges documented confessions detailing midwives supposedly smothering children or dedicating them to demons. But nowhere are the words of the accused preserved freely. Their explanations, their grief, their defense, were either destroyed or reshaped to confirm accusation. The written word became a weapon, stripping them of dignity and voice. This pattern reflects a broader reality. The history of women's suffering in childbirth was filtered through the lens of male authority. Physicians who had likely never witnessed labor firsthand published treatises on birth that dismissed or condemned midwives. Methods. Clerical authorities judged infants who died unbaptized, but spared no thought for the mother who had fought in agony. Midwives were present in rooms of blood and pain, yet absent from the shelves of official history. The silence is unnatural, manufactured by power. And within this erasure lies the greatest horror. Generations of women endured unbearable risk giving birth. Countless midwives exhausted themselves in service, and unnumbered infants died in the struggle. Yet the human testimonies, the words spoken between women, the wisdom of mothers, they dissolved into dust, overwritten by decrees. What remains in the archives is not their memory, but their condemnation. The silence is itself a crime. Though flames consumed their bodies, neglect consumed their voices. The result is a history skewed toward authority and terror, a record of how easily entire lifetimes can be reduced to a line. Executed as witch. The history of midwives is not only a record of individual tragedy. It is the story of a debt carried across generations. The destruction of women who delivered life, the silencing of their knowledge, and the persecution that cast them as witches left scars still visible in maternal history. The price paid was not borne by them alone. It was transferred to the daughters who came after, and to countless lives lost unnecessarily. When midwives were accused, tortured, and executed, their knowledge perished with them. Herbal wisdom, birthing techniques, and methods of easing suffering disappeared into ash. Physicians who replaced them often lacked practical skill. In many cases, the transition to male-dominated medicine increased maternal mortality across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The elimination of experienced women brought not progress, but regression, as families mourned mothers who might have survived with the aid of those condemned as witches. The social consequences were equally chilling. To accuse a midwife was to fracture trust within communities. Women could no longer rely confidently on those who shared their experience. Reproduction itself became more tightly surveilled by clerical and state authority, turning women's bodies into sites of control. Where once midwives represented communal support, their removal left women isolated, suffering in fear and silence under rules devised by men. The shadow of those deaths stretches into the modern era. Even today, maternal mortality remains highest where midwifery knowledge has been undervalued or erased. In the global South, where midwives continue to serve as frontline caregivers, their struggle for recognition echoes the past. In parts of developed nations, the tension between medicalized childbirth and midwifery-led approaches recalls the same contest that condemned so many centuries ago. The suspicion has changed form, but not disappeared. To study this history is to confront the full weight of cruelty justified through faith, law, and fear. The midwives paid in flesh, in blood, and in silence. Communities paid through ignorance and unnecessary death. Humanity paid through centuries of loss, erasing women who carried both knowledge and care. The horrifying truth is that the price has never been fully repaid. It lingers, carved into the statistics of maternal death, whispered in forgotten graves, and preserved in trial records that survive not as testimony of life, but as memorials of injustice.